we have quite a special treat, another. We're gonna bring on for you all to hear Emily Hanford. I'm sure Emily Hanford needs no introduction. Her reporting on reading, and especially her podcast, Sold a Story, indeed has captured national attention. And it has put a spotlight on the need to improve reading instruction. While her busy schedule didn't permit her to be with us today, we were able to get Emily and Oakland reading advocate Kareem Weaver together to discuss some of the key issues with Emily's work and some of its implications for California. So without further ado, let's hear from Emily Hanford and Kareem Weaver.
So glad to be joined today by Emily Hanford, who is a journalist who needs no introduction. I'm just so grateful that you took the time to join us for the California Reading Summit. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, Kareem. Hi, everyone at the summit.
I'm so glad you could be here because there are some questions I think people have for you specifically because the impact you've made on the field in the last couple of years. I mean, the podcast Sold a Story has just taken off and it really has sparked a lot of conversation. So thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to the conversation. So with that being said, let's jump right into it, because since Sold a Story came out, and I mean, you've had other work as well, along with your other work, your other podcasts, which I encourage everyone to check out. Phonics has kind of become the major focus in schools, right? Not just in California, but across the country and even around the world. Is that it? Is that the answer? Is it about phonics, according to your journalism and your investigation, what you found? Is that the answer to improving the reading results?
Well, it's clearly part of it. But what was interesting is Sold a Story, which came out about a year ago, is actually not really about phonics. It's actually very much about the idea that balanced literacy became this idea that I think one of the ideas that I discovered was sort of like a core undergirding balanced literacy is this idea that, yes, we do a little bit of phonics, but we also teach kids all these other ways that they can get access to text, all these other ways that they can read words. So Sold a Story is 6 episodes and like close to 5 hours. And the whole thing is just about this one idea. And the one idea is when you're teaching little kids to read, you don't have to teach them how to sound out the words because they don't have to sound out the words. They can use all these other strategies instead. And I was really looking at that idea in particular. So my earlier work, which you mentioned, did focus quite a bit on phonics instruction, partly because phonics is what we've been fighting about forever. And I think what has not been well understood is why phonics instruction matters. Like, I think that's one of the things that's been missing for a lot of teachers, why phonics skills are critical to becoming a good reader. Like, you can't be a good reader without having good decoding skills. And so I think a lot of teachers didn't understand very much about how kids learn to read. And didn't understand then why teaching phonics was so important. But then Sold a Story in particular was about, hey, it's not just about phonics. Just because you've added some phonics doesn't mean that the way you're teaching is really lining up with what all this research shows us about how people learn to read. Because in fact, one of the most critical things you can do for kids at the beginning stages of them learning how to read is really teach them to attend really carefully to the words themselves and look at how the words are spelled and teach the kids about how words are spelled and how they can break words apart and blend them together, because that is really the most effective way to get kids on the path to being good word readers, which is essential to being a good reader, to comprehending what you read, but definitely not the only thing. And I would say this last thing, I actually think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about phonics, and there always has been. And I would say part of the misunderstanding goes to my fellow professionals, to reporters who I think are not reporting this story quite right. I'm seeing headlines like phonics are back, a resurgence of phonics, back to the basics. And there's a part of that that's true. But I think what's been missing all along is, or what's happening right now in a lot of schools is a lot of teachers and other educators are having these big aha moments where they're really understanding a huge amount of stuff they didn't know before that they should have known. And it's not their fault for not knowing, but they didn't have access to for various reasons about just how kids learn to read, why and how phonics instruction matters, why you need to do that, but all these other parts that are so important. And you, of course, were a teacher, so you know that phonics is just one little part of it, right?
It's one little part of it. And I'm even seeing, unfortunately, I think the sector is so sensitive to getting that piece wrong, of overemphasizing it, over-indexing on phonics, that I've seen a lot of people almost discount it. They say, no, this isn't just phonics, as if that's not a critical component. in an effort, I'm assuming, not to upset people or not to trigger some ideological tensions or what have you. If phonics is important, just like phonemic awareness is important. I just, it's an ongoing challenge to have a culture that's okay with all the various components.
Yeah. I hear you. I think there's such a fear. There's a fear that we like once overcorrected with too much phonics. I'm not sure that's quite true.
Right.
But there's this fear that like we once overcorrected with too much, so let's not do that again. So it's a little bit like, yeah, I'm going to tell you phonics is important, but I realize I'm throwing out the most controversial little bomb here, so I'm not going to go too far. And so I think you make a good point, which is like we also need to fully embrace how absolutely critical this is and get it right. Get it right.
You got to have it. Well, so that's next question would be about, is it okay to do both? So there's structured literacy, which, systematic, explicit, direct instruction, those 5 components, plus oral language development, plus writing. I get that. And then you've got balanced literacy with all the different methods that go, all the different approaches that are underneath the umbrella of that method. But that distinction, that choice, people say, well, maybe that's a red herring. Maybe we don't have to choose. Maybe we can do both. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's kind of how we got to where we are right now. So I think that's what people have been saying, some version of that for the past 20 years or so, because by the late 90s and early 2000s, we had a substantial amount of research that showed us the components of reading that you were just referring to, right, and how important phonics was and other elements, right? And so there was this idea that I think from people who were quite disdainful of phonics at one point, because the whole language movement really writ large, I'm not saying everyone, but like in general, it was quite disdainful of this idea that kids need to sort of start with the letters and sounds, as that's the most effective way to do it. And so I think over the past 20 years, there's been this kind of like, oh, we're checking the box on phonics. We can do both. We don't have to have a war here. This is a truce, balanced literacy. We can do it all. And I think there's a few problems with that. I think one problem is the thing we really investigate in Sold a Story, which is you've got to look at these ways that reading has been taught and sort of trace it back to their origins. Like, what are the foundational ideas behind it? And are those right? So I think one of the things I've been trying to show in my reporting is a lot of what balanced literacy is based on is sort of founded in an idea that turns out not to be right about how kids learn to read. So I think that's really important to understand. I think it's also really important to understand that in education, we're often just adding more, like telling schools to do more, buying more programs, giving teachers more to do without taking anything away, without saying, oh, wait a minute, we've got to kind of take a clean look at what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Like I've gone into many schools and seen this, which I think is really interesting, is I first saw this in a principal's office in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but she had these big, huge sticky things, up on her wall. And it said it was the things that they were going to stop. It's the things that they were going to stop doing, the things that they were going to start doing, and the things they were going to keep doing. So there are a lot of elements that come from balanced literacy that were on the keep list, making sure kids get time to read, good literature in kids' hands, lots of time spent on the sort of oral language comprehension side of things. But then there were things to stop doing, like teaching those cueing strategies and others. And then there were things to start doing, like teaching phonics in a really like direct and explicit and systematic way.
That reminds me of a survey that was given, it's about 10 years ago, about the components of literacy and this idea of balanced literacy. It means different things to different people. Different educators would perceive or had internalized different components as being essential to balanced literacy. For some people, it might be having a level library. For some people, it might be cueing. For some people, it might include some phonics instruction and a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But when we say balanced literacy, it's almost like an umbrella term for so many different approaches to instruction, which makes it really hard to make global statements other than it's not consistent. I mean, that's one statement because it means so many different things to so many different people. I'm sorry, that includes kids who are English language learners.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, I mean, you're talking about getting off to a good start and being launched, having a good foundation. And we refer to the science of reading as a way to, but from your reporting, what about approaches to supporting English language learners? Does the science of reading as an umbrella term, is that something that's helpful to them? I mean, I've got my thoughts about it. But I'm curious based on your reporting, what you found, or do you think they need something different from what other kids need?
Well, I think there's a few things that everyone should know. And I think this is a really, really important thing to be talking about in this country and especially in California. So I'm glad we're talking about it. Really, really critical. I mean, one thing that's really important to know is that a lot of the research that's been done over the past 20 years has been done in other languages, right? It's not just looking at kids who are learning to read in English. It's not just looking at kids who are learning to read in their first language, right? So the science of reading does include a significant amount of research about kids learning to read in one language, but speaking in another language. In fact, right here, this is a book that I highly recommend to everyone. This is Literary Foundations for English Learners by Elsa Cardenas Hagen. I've just been reading this entire book, and it really has a lot of important things in it. But one of the things it makes really clear is that the science of reading definitely includes English learners and learning to read in lots of different languages. But I think there's a really important and legitimate conversation that goes on among advocates for English learners, who I think, getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning, have a really good reason to want to make sure that we don't overcorrect on the side of phonics at the cost of the other elements, because those other elements are critical for all kids. They're really critical for English learners, right? Because what a kid who comes into school, who's, for example, speaking Spanish at home, maybe speaks a little bit of English, but Spanish is really the language they know how to speak when they come to school. And then often they're coming into a school where they're being expected to learn to read in English. So that kid has a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work just on building their English vocabulary and their knowledge of how English works that needs to be developed, as well as learning how to read that language. And there's a huge amount that can be used by teachers where they can draw on the similarities among the languages, right? There are like some really, there's stuff you can see that are similar in Spanish and English.
Yeah.
Teachers need to understand that and use kids like strengths in their first language to help them learn to read in a second language, while they're also learning to speak or get better at their language comprehension abilities in the language that is not their first language.
And you mentioned some of the components of early reading. Well, in that book by Dr. Elsa, she showed me also that there was a second reading panel and a report for bilingual learners.
Yeah.
I didn't, and she sent me on a journey. I started researching and I read it, had to pay for it, but I read it. It was phenomenal. And basically, it's just like you said. So we have those core elements, but also the writing and the oral language development and being very intentional about that. I agree with you 100% on that.
Yeah, I would just say that point one more time. A lot of people know about the National Reading Panel report, but there was a similar one. I'm pretty sure it came out in 2006, and it's called the National Panel on Minority Language Youth or something like that. And basically, it's a national reading panel looking at kids who are speaking other languages and learning English in school. And it's really important for people to realize that that's there and to take a look at it.
Let me ask you another question. You probably have heard reading recovery and similar programs like LLI with Fonda Pinel, very popular in California, very popular to support kids who are struggling to read. But there's been some pushback about the longitudinal impacts of these programs, of the learning and how it endures or doesn't. I don't know if you've been following that.
Yeah, actually, people can Google. We produced a story on it actually in April of 2022. April of 2022, there was this huge, one of the largest studies ever, randomized controlled studies ever, of a reading intervention program, a study of reading recovery that started back in 2009, 2010, huge amount of federal money behind it, followed lots of kids in lots of schools, looking at the effectiveness of reading recovery and scaling it up, and initially found some really positive things, found some real benefits to kids in the early grades. And a lot of other research that's been done on reading recovery, and reading recovery's own data shows this. Right. But then what they were able to do more recently over the past few years is spin that out further. What happens to those kids when they get to third and fourth grade and beyond? And what they found, and some other research of reading recovery has shown, is that the kids who got reading recovery in first grade ended up doing not as well as the kids who were similar to them who didn't get reading recovery. They actually doing a little bit worse by third and fourth grade. And that's actually pretty rare to see an educational intervention have a negative impact. It's quite common to see an educational intervention have no impact or very little impact. It's rare for it to have a negative impact. And that's what the research found. And so I think that's really been a reckoning and a moment of really hard questioning for a lot of people. And I think what I have tried to show in my reporting is that some of the ideas behind reading recovery are the very same ideas that are behind LLI and Fountas and Pinnell's work, right? Fountas and Pinnell, Gay-Sue Pinnell in particular, is one of the people who brought Marie Clay, the founder of Reading Recovery, to the United States in the 1980s and supported the scale up of reading recovery in the United States. And a lot of the stuff that she's developed with her co-author, Irene Fountas, guided reading, and a lot of the other sort of routines and ways that many teachers run a balanced literacy classroom are rooted in a lot of those Fountas and Pinnell ideas that come in large part from reading recovery. They're really an adaptation of a lot of the reading recovery ideas beyond first grade and beyond struggling readers. Let's use these ideas that we thought were really working for first grade struggling readers. Let's scale it up to kids in all grades, even in the general classroom. And so I think it's important to now look and recognize, oh, the research about reading recovery maybe wasn't telling us quite what we thought it was telling us. So I think that's one other reason to question core classroom instruction that's based on those ideas. You know, one of the things that I think is really like, I'm optimistic about, because obviously this is a difficult one for me because I'm like a human being. I'm a mother, I'm a citizen. I want to be a grandmother someday. So I like care how the story ends. So I'm a journalist, but I still want this to go well. Like I want schools to get better at teaching reading. I want kids to be doing better. But one of the things that really I find really hopeful is I was just doing some interviews with some teachers that I've talked to before. I was re-interviewing a few of them. And one of the themes in the conversations is that they think that what this whole conversation about the science of reading has done for them, and what they're noticing that it's done for some of their colleagues and people they see out there on social media, is it's gotten them to be more critical. It's gotten them to ask more questions. So they've had this big aha, they've learned a bunch of stuff, but they're very much doing this. Let's not get dogmatic about this. Let's not get entrenched in these new understandings, these new beliefs. And a lot of them have said, like, I am a more critical consumer now. And that's awesome. Like that's exactly what everyone needs to be, is a more critical consumer of all of these things, whatever it is, a new idea, a new curriculum, whatever it is.
Well, listen, I appreciate you. I'm so glad. First of all, you know I love you. I'm just so glad that you're here and on the case and working hard and doing great work. And as a person, I appreciate you and family. And thank you for joining us.
Back at you in terms of appreciating you and the work you do. Great to talk to you.